Ready to go again? Okay, let's go ahead and recommence. All right, is there any question or discussion that you would like to raise about any of these topics we've talked about? Yes?
I think this stuff's brilliant. One reason is that I saw a website aimed contra Craig.
Oh.
I don't know if you've seen it.
Yeah, I've looked at it once. That was enough.
His main objection is about the role of you mentioning the Holy Spirit and this sudden Craig letting in the irrationality side of things. And so I think this is better.
Yeah. I was very gratified to see planning and developing his epistemology in this direction, because I think it's thoroughly biblical. I think it's right out of the New Testament, and was the direction that I had been moving in as well, in a much less sophisticated way. But you're right, these infidel types who are very committed to an epistemology of evidentialism don't understand this model. They think it's fideism. They think it's utter irrationality. But as the quotation at the head of the talk, I think it puts it so well, from Steve Evans and Merrill Westphal, Enlightenment critiques of the reasonableness of religious belief point to defects not so much in religious belief as in the conceptions of knowledge uncritically adopted as the basis of these critiques. Maybe religious knowledge looks dubious because we have the wrong idea about what it is to know something and how we know what we know. And I think that's absolutely right about these infidel websites, that they have the wrong epistemology, and that's why to them religious belief not founded on evidence just appears so mad.
There was another question I had.
Mm-hmm.
Was that there was a sort of suggestion with God not putting the signs in the sky because there's no reason that God would want us to believe that He exists. Just made me wonder if that relates to the question of what's the role of apologetics in showing that God exists rather than showing the gospel, showing the relationship.
Yes. Well, as I said, of course, to believe in God, you have to believe that God exists. And so I think that apologetics is one of the means by which the Holy Spirit can bring people to believe that God exists. But in that sense, apologetics doesn't complete the task. It brings a person to the crisis of faith, and now the question is, are you going to commit your life to the person whom apologetics has led you to believe exists? So apologetics would just be one means of bringing a person to that belief, but it's not necessary. I think apologetics provides arguments which are sufficient for justified and warranted belief in Christian truth claims, but it's not necessary.
Would that not raise the question, why hasn't God given that sort of sufficient? If it's a helpful thing to do, why hasn't God already made it sufficient to do?
Okay, I guess I didn't make this clear, but the kind of behind this is the assumption on my part that God knows what evidence would be sufficient to bring open-minded people to belief in Him, and there's no need on His part to provide more evidence of His existence if He knew that it wouldn't do any good. In other words, if you presuppose that God has what is called middle knowledge, then He knows exactly how people would respond in any circumstances they might be in, including how much evidence would be necessary for them to make a well-informed decision about that. And I think it may well be the case that God has given evidence in the actual world which is sufficient for bringing the open-minded and open-hearted people who are the good soil described in the parable of the sower to faith in Him. And He's under absolutely no moral obligation to provide more evidence of His existence, because even if He did, it wouldn't bring any more people to salvation, to faith in Him. The thorny soil, the rocky soil, would still, even if it came to believe that God exists, wouldn't come to know Him and His salvation. So what the atheist has to show here, I think, is that there is a world that is feasible for God in which more people come to know and to love God and find His salvation than do in the actual world. And I think that's absolutely hopeless for the atheist to try to prove that. That's just pure conjecture. So I'm assuming a kind of middle knowledge perspective here, that God knows what kind of evidence to give in order to bring the good soil to belief in Him freely. Is that answer clear? I hope that answer was clear, because this is a vital question in this whole hiddenness of God debate. It's sort of like, have you ever used epoxy glue, where you have to have two parts of the glue? You put on one part that is the glue, and then you have to add another part which is a hardener and makes the glue fixed. And if you don't have the hardener, you can add all the glue you want and it won't make anything stick. Well, I sort of see that as an illustration of evidence. If God knows that all the evidence in the world won't meet with a response of love and openness, then there's no necessity for Him to give that other portion, because it wouldn't do any good anyway if the person wouldn't respond. So if God knows that the person is lacking, say, in the open heart or the open mind to respond to the evidence in saving faith, God's under no obligation to provide that evidence, I think, to such a person, because He knows it wouldn't do any good. Sergio.
This goes with what Apostle John says in chapter 20. He said, if it is to write down all the things that Jesus did, say we don't have plenty papers or plenty books to write.
Yeah.
But all things which will be written just for you to know. So
yes.
I think he thinks that all he wrote in his book, in his gospel, it was enough, sufficient, so you believe in God.
Yeah. And read especially 1 John chapter 5, where he says, for example, the Spirit, referring to the Holy Spirit, the Spirit is the witness, because the Spirit is the truth. If we receive the testimony of men, the testimony of God is greater, and this is the testimony that God has borne witness to His Son. He who believes that Jesus is the Son of God has the testimony in himself. So on John's epistemology, he thinks that the testimony of the Holy Spirit is even greater than human evidence and testimony, including the apostolic testimony that's even recorded in his gospel. So I think that John, like Paul, is committed to this kind of an epistemology based on the internal witness of the Holy Spirit.
But what this stuff does, I mean, it seems when that argument is presented, it just sounds like a sort of circular argument that a Christian has in their own head, and that's a sort of self-justifying thing. But what this material does is actually give a reason for that argument, which actually is a linear argument. Exactly.
And I think that's why, even though, for example, theologians have long spoken of the witness of the Holy Spirit as the basis for Christian knowledge of God, the reason that planning his work has been so influential is precisely because of what you said. He didn't just formulate this in Christian theological terminology, but he formulated it and did it in the terminology of mainstream analytic epistemology, and basically exposed every other alternative account of Warrant as inadequate, and then proposes his own account in terms of proper functioning. And as a result, it's just had enormous impact and influence because of the way in which Plantinga did this. And it's a good lesson to us who want to be, I think, Christian apologists, to recognize we need to be operating within the mainstream categories of where the philosophical discipline is at present, if we're to be heard. Yes, Peter.
Thanks very much. Just on what is page 8 of, I think most people say, just after footnote 5, there's a sentence. Just as perceptual beliefs like there is a tree are not based on arguments from more basic beliefs, but arise spontaneously in me when I am in the circumstances of the tree appearing to be there, so the belief God exists arises spontaneously in me when I am in appropriate circumstances such as motive, guilt, gratitude, or at nature's grandeur as a result of working the working of the sensus divinitatis. Now, I'm just struggling a little bit with this. That one is in a certain condition, and it's only when you are ever in that condition that spontaneously something arises. And it's the connection between that condition and the spontaneous arising that I'm struggling with. I mean, because in some sense there must be the conditions are a necessary cause for that spontaneous arising. Aren't we having event without cause here, in some sense?
Oh, I don't think that's what he meant by spontaneous. What he meant was, I think, there is that you don't infer from your experience some belief. For example, I don't infer that there are red chairs in this room because I think, well, I am being appeared to in a red chair way, and my sensory mechanisms are probably reliable, therefore I probably do see a red chair there. No, when I walk into the room, my cognitive faculties are so designed that I immediately infer, or not infer, I use the wrong word, I immediately think there is a red chair there. And that's the sense in which it's spontaneous. Not that it's uncaused, but that it's not an inference.
It's immediate.
Yes.
Sort of
it's non-inferential. That's the key. It's not an argument based upon inference.
But the red chair causes you to perceive it.
Yeah, the light rays bouncing off of the red chair and entering my retina would, cause me to have that appearance. And then my faculties are designed to form the belief when I'm appeared to in that way.
So, in that sense, God exists, and God causes you to perceive His existence because you've got properly functioning faculties.
Well, what?
I'm sorry.
I'm not sure that's what he's saying. For example, take the beauty of nature around us. And this would be obviously planning a sort of take or interpretation of Romans chapter 1, where all persons know from creation that God exists. I think planning would say that human beings have been designed in such a way that when they are confronted with the grandeur and the beauty and intricacy of nature, their cognitive faculties spontaneously form the belief all this has been created by God. Well, it's not like God is causing that belief in them in some way that makes them a sort of puppet or passive observer, but it's more that their faculties are just designed to recognize God's handiwork when they're confronted with it.
That's part of their hardware program.
Yeah, part of the hardware would be this tendency, I guess, to form the belief all this has been created by God when they're confronted with it. Just like I have the tendency to form beliefs, there is blank when I'm appeared to in that way. And that's part of the way God has designed us as human beings to be, to just immediately form the belief in His existence in certain contexts. And I think Plantinga would say, well, he does say, that if it were not for sin and human fallenness, that everybody would believe in God. One of the implications of Plantinga's view that is often not put out on the table, but I mean is quietly there, is that atheists are all irrational. Because on his view, they're dysfunctional. Their cognitive faculties are malfunctioning in not forming the belief that God exists. So his view actually has this fairly brash and bold implication that atheists are all irrational. Yes?
Sorry, moving questions in a slightly different direction. This sort of approach to epistemology, however sort of biblically grounded, provide this sort of being a favourite way of forming a form of religious epistemology that are still wholesome. For example, if you can sort of transfer, so that's a want of belief to Islamic God. pretty much.
Yeah.
But what would you say would be the greatest weakness in this form of epistemology, the greatest holes that need to be plugged?
Well, let's talk about this. Since you've raised the question, let me deal with that part of the paper where I respond to it. In other words, our sister here is saying, couldn't the Muslims say the same thing, that Allah has designed our cognitive faculties to form belief in His existence, and therefore Christians are all irrational? Well, let's take a look at where I left off reading. What might be said by way of assessment of Planting as religious epistemology? It will be recalled that Planting embarked on two projects, a public one and a private, Christian one. His public project was to show that there is no reason to think that Christian belief lacks justification, rationality, or warrant, apart from presupposing Christianity's falsehood. The most common objection lodged against the success of this public project is that it leads to radical relativism. If belief in God or Christianity can be properly basic, then just any belief, it is alleged, such as Linus' belief in the great pumpkin, can be properly basic. Now, with respect to justification, this allegation is in fact true. We can imagine someone placed in circumstances in which belief in the great pumpkin, which for those of you who don't know, this is a cartoon by Charles Schulz, where Linus believes that every Halloween the great pumpkin will come back and appear to those who believe in him. You may not even have Halloween in some European countries. That's the holiday that is the evening before All Saints' Day, on which the spirits are supposed to be out and active and so forth. Anyway, we can imagine someone being justified in belief in the great pumpkin in a properly basic way. For example, maybe Linus's parents assured him of the existence of the great pumpkin, just as some normally trustworthy parents assure their children of the reality of Santa Claus or St. Nicholas or Father Christmas. Since beliefs grounded in testimony are on Plantinga's analysis properly basic, it follows that Linus's belief in the great pumpkin is, in such circumstances, properly basic with respect to justification. But this admission is for Plantinga inconsequential. It does not imply that bizarre beliefs, like belief in the great pumpkin, are properly basic for normally situated adults. In order to be properly basic with respect to justification, a belief must be appropriately grounded in the circumstances. And for most people, belief in the great pumpkin is not. More importantly, belief in the great pumpkin is not in any case implied by Plantinga's epistemology to be properly basic with respect to warrant. Just because certain beliefs are properly basic with respect to warrant in no way implies that any arbitrarily selected belief is also warranted in this way. In Linus's case, the cognitive environment is not appropriate because he is being lied to, and therefore his belief is unwarranted. Thus, even if, on Plantinga's theory, Linus is within his rational rights in believing in the great pumpkin, it does not follow that he knows that the great pumpkin exists. But it has been objected, if Christian epistemologists can legitimately claim that their beliefs are properly basic, then any community of epistemologists, for example, voodoo epistemologists, can also legitimately claim that their beliefs are properly basic, no matter how bizarre they might be. Plantinga calls this objection the son of great pumpkin objection. Again, he freely admits that the objection or the allegation is correct with respect to justification. We can easily imagine circumstances under which voodoo epistemologists could legitimately claim that their beliefs in voodoo are justified in a basic way. The important question is whether they could legitimately claim that voodoo beliefs are properly basic with respect to warrant. The answer to that question, says Plantinga, will depend on what we mean by legitimately. If we mean justifiably, then once again Plantinga freely admits that they could, but he sees no relativistic consequences flowing from this admission. Being justified is just too easy a state to attain to be of much significance. Voodoo epistemologists under the influence of a native narcotic might well be within their rational rights in thinking that voodoo beliefs are properly basic with respect to warrant. But no relativistic conclusion follows from that. Do we mean by legitimately then, warrantedly? If so, then nothing in Plantinga's model implies that the voodoo epistemologists are warranted in their claim. On the contrary, insofar as voodoo beliefs are incompatible with the innate sensus divinitatis, Plantinga's model implies that voodoo epistemologists cannot be warranted in claiming that their beliefs are properly basic with respect to warrant. Thus, Plantinga's model does not lead to relativism. Interestingly, Plantinga does concede that practitioners of other theistic religions, like the Christian, can argue with equal cogency that, say, a Muslim version of Plantinga's model is epistemically possible, philosophically unobjectionable given the truth of Islam, and probably warranted in a way similar to that described in the model if Islam is true. So he admits what you said, that the Muslim could legitimately say all of the same things about Islam. But such a conclusion does not support relativism. It merely shows that there is no de jure objection to other theistic faiths, independent of de facto objections to them. Perhaps even more significantly, it is not the case that such a concession holds for any belief set. In particular, it does not hold in Plantinga's views for naturalism. For if naturalism is true, then it is not likely that our belief-forming mechanisms are reliable, since they are not aimed at truth, but merely are selected for survival. Thus, although adherents of other theistic religions could cogently argue on behalf of their religions what Plantinga argues on behalf of Christian belief, the same cannot be said for what in the Western academic world, in particular the European academic world, is the main alternative to Christian belief today. So I think that Plantinga is quite right in saying that, and that there isn't any relativistic consequences that follows from that. It just would follow that you can't have a de jure objection to Islam or Mormonism any more than you can have a de jure objection to Christianity. And I don't find that objectionable. I don't think that's a problem. Okay? Yeah, Lorsch?
Well, I think I found this immensely helpful, Plantinga's approach to say that Christianity is actually epistemically permissible, and it's a legitimate option. Mm-hmm. In my own setting, working in the setting of journalism and communication training, which has been so heavily influenced by Marxism. So we could then say, why is Marxism the only viable alternative to do training on the basis of? Couldn't we equally do it on the basis of Christian worldview? And that is actually gradually being people grasp that, and they see the relevance of it.
Insofar as Marxist-Leninism is committed to dialectical materialism, it falls into the same category as naturalism. Our belief-forming mechanisms are not aimed at truth, but simply at survival. And therefore, the Marxist-Leninists can have no confidence at all that his cognitive faculties are functioning properly.
That's right. So it's just even, well, then we're taking the argument back to that.
Yeah.
But then on the other hand, of course, the view of humanity in Marxism is more humanistic and naturalistic, whereas the view of history, I think, is more naturalistic.
But insofar as it would endorse a naturalistic account of biological evolution,
it holds for this, of course.
Yeah.
But my point was just that, to how helpful this material is in terms of saying that Christianity is a possible option.
Yeah, that it's permissible.
Be ruled out beforehand.
Right. He doesn't claim to prove that Christianity is true. He's just saying that if it's true, there's no de jure objection to it, and that there aren't any good reasons to think that such a model could not be true, that it could not work. Yes?
Follow up with a question. Hasn't Plantinga been attacked for arguing in a circular manner in terms of his, at some point it's said that he also wants to present an argument, this as a theistic argument.
Yeah.
So how does that relate to this not being an argument, but still being a theistic argument?
Well, the theistic argument would look a little bit different. It would say something like this. Warrant is based upon the proper functioning of our cognitive faculties. And that would be based on his critique of other attempts to give an account of warrant that doesn't appeal to proper functioning. But then he would say that the naturalist can give no satisfactory account of what it means to function properly. That the only available account of proper functioning would be a design account. That properly functioning faculties are faculties that function according to their design plan. But a design plan implies a designer. And so you have there a kind of argument from design based upon the proper functioning of our cognitive faculties. So that would be a different route to take the argument. Yeah, a parallel argument that he doesn't push hard, but I think he recognizes that, in a sense, this whole account does give grounds for belief in theism because there isn't any other available account of what it means to function properly, apart from functioning as something was designed to do. Yes, Daniel.
Plantinga assumes that the main objections against Christianity today are the de jure objections. Do you think that he's right? I've been thinking about that, whether this is true for Europe. I would like to think that he's not so right.
Yeah, I agree with you.
I mean, he gets it quite right when he analyzes Freud. He works out that it is really an objection against. But no, that presupposes the denial of the truth of Christianity. My conclusion would be that also Freudianism you have to attack by defending the truth of Christianity. And by pointing out that they have no reason to deny the truth of Christianity.
Yeah, I'm inclined to agree that the most important attacks upon Christian belief today are not de jure objections, but are de facto. And I think here of, for example, the problem of evil, all the suffering in the world, or the problem of, say, religious relativism shows that Christianity cannot be true, or the whole attack upon the historical Jesus and the attempt to reconstruct the historical Jesus in such a way as to make him merely a human figure. So this is only a partial apologetic in my mind. It does, I think, take the teeth out of any sort of de jure objection to Christianity, and it forces the unbeliever to say why he thinks Christianity is false. But then we're going to have to be prepared to meet those defeaters and to argue against those.
Yeah. If we get Europeans to that point where they say why they think that Christianity is false, then we've made a big step, because what is very powerful in Europe is, I think, where partly it's this methodological naturalism and partly it's this Kantian move just to define God out of rationality.
Yeah.
Which is just baffling. They just say, well, once you bring in God, it's not scientific or not rational anymore.
Yeah, and this would just evacuate that of any tenability, I think, don't you?
If it can be applied to this effectively in the European context, that would be an achievement.
Yeah, and this is where you folks, if you're interested in this area, could apply this to, say, Kant, if that is a major influence, say you're German. I would encourage you to develop a talk where you explain to your audience, say, Kant's religious epistemology and his objection to belief or to thinking of God as a rationally knowable being through reason, apart from practical reason, through theoretical reason, and then use this epistemology to answer Kant and see what your audience says. Because I think, as Daniel says, among German theologians at least, Kant is just sort of taken as presupposed. It's not as though they have a deep understanding of his epistemology. It's just taken for granted. At least this is what my German friends tell me. Yes?
I have many questions, but just one. When I try to argue and say belief in God is not properly basic because it's not self-evident, it needs to be shown or demonstrated somehow by some evidences, usually logical. Usually people answer to me that God then is subject to logic. I must either start with logic or God. And they say with planting up, let's start with God, not with logic.
I'm sure that Alvin Plantinga would see that as a false dichotomy. Early on in his epistemology, he was accused of being a fideist, that is to say, of just believing in God by faith, just a sheer leap of faith. And he made it very clear that beliefs which are properly basic are not taken by faith. Properly basic beliefs are among what he calls the deliverances of reason. That they are rational beliefs which reason delivers to us for belief. But they're just not inferred. They're just not inferred from more basic beliefs. But they are among the beliefs or the deliverances of reason. So this isn't in any way opposed to logic. On the contrary, Plantinga would say that properly basic beliefs would have to be logically consistent. That if your basic beliefs are inconsistent with each other, or in some other way are incoherent, that you are irrational, and that you have to abandon some of your beliefs in order to bring rationality into your noetic structure. So he's deeply committed to logic as well as to God in his epistemology.
It is said here that he distinguishes justification and warrant.
Yeah.
What about evidentialists? They do not distinguish.
Well, I think that a lot of folks are recognizing that. Well, no, it is recognized. Let me put it this way. The traditional definition of knowledge was justified true belief. And that equated justification with warrant. But as a result of a number of paradoxes that seem to arise as a result of this definition of knowledge as justified true belief, it does seem that many epistemologists have broken away justification from something else. You could call it warrant or something else that will make a belief not only justified for you in the sense of being within your rational rights or exhibiting no flaw in your noetic structure, and making that belief actual knowledge. So although this is something that is not the traditional view of knowledge, it distinguishes warrant from justification. This is a move that is very commonly made among epistemologists today. Now, of course, you could just define justification in such a way that by justification you mean what Plantinga calls warrant. But then it's just a matter of semantics. Then you're just defining the word in different ways. But by justification, Plantinga just means what you're within your rational rights to believe. And that's why he says it's so easy to be justified in things. The voodoo epistemologist who's under the influence of drugs is justified in believing in voodoo because he's acting within his rational rights if he's, under the influence of this narcotic or something. So it's just too easy to be justified on his view. But that's not uncommon distinction, I think. But it's an important one to grasp. Okay. Do you want to do the valuations then now, since we have 5 minutes left?
We only have 5 minutes left until it's time to break for dinner this evening. So if you just take the last few minutes and fill out that evaluation sheet. If anybody did not get an evaluation sheet, thank you.
While you fill those out, let me encourage you, if you're interested in this whole area of religious epistemology, to read Alvin Plantinga's book, Warranted Christian Belief. It is not a difficult read. It's a long book. It's a big book, but it's not a difficult book. And this lays out very clearly his epistemology, and I think you would find this to be very helpful. And again, let me remind any of you, if you're interested in getting Philosophia Christi, becoming a member of the EPS, we have these membership applications here.